Welcome. I'm joined today by Kristian Rönn, the author of The Darwinian Trap. An insightful book. It'll have you rethinking everything from why corporations do what they do to how the evolutionary arms race found in nature might actually be playing out in your workplace, in shopping malls and in the halls of power. Kristian is the CEO and co-founder of Normative. He has a diverse background in mathematics, philosophy, computer science and AI. He also worked at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute for a while. I believe he did some background research on Nick Bostone's bestseller Superintelligence. So enjoy the interview and do me a favour, if you liked this video, please share it, like it and subscribe. Thank you so much. Peace. Kristian, it's really great having you on the show. Firstly, this topic is really fascinating, as the viewers will soon discover, and also highly impactful. So would you give us a background on what got you interested in how evolutionary pressures shape our collective behaviours?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the first sort of glimpse I got back when I just sort of finished high school and I was actually writing to become a better Python programmer. I was writing my own evolutionary sort of simulations, simulating predator and prey dynamic. And what I discovered shocked me a little bit. Because when I did this agent-based modeling, it seemed to be the case that the predators evolved to become super aggressive because they had evolutionary pressure to be aggressive and sort of outcompete other predators. But that often resulted in them being so aggressive, so eventually they killed all of the prey and then died themselves in the process, and essentially killed all life in the simulation, basically. So then it sort of occurred to me that evolution through natural selection is this short-sighted optimization algorithm. And what I mean by that is that it's not like evolution through natural selection is predicting consequences in the future. It basically just looks from one generation to another. Is this particular trait adaptive? And if the answer is yes, then that trait survives from one generation to another. But over time, it could actually be the case that what is adaptive in the short term actually kills you in the long term. So that got me thinking about evolutionary selection pressures more broadly. And then I sort of went down this rabbit hole and learned more about multi-level selection and how you can sort of see natural selection as this universal thing that acts on any type of entity with a specific set of properties. There is some sort of replication, and for each replication there is some sort of change, and then there is some sort of external selection pressure. And if you have those traits, you see evolution through natural selection, it doesn't matter if it's biological or if it's an enterprise or if it's a society or a group of people, or even within our own body, the individual genes and molecules and so on. So this is sort of acting at multiple levels. And then it sort of occurred to me that, this finding, what I saw when I played around with this evolutionary simulation, and extinction happening because of evolutionary selection pressures themselves, can this actually be applied to what else is going on with our nuclear arms races and climate catastrophes and now the emergent risk of extinction from artificial intelligence. So that's long story short.
Yeah, well, it's really amazing that evolution both has the seeds of cooperation, seeds of competition in it. I remember doing some reading a while back. It just appeared to me then. There's this kind of goat that has evolved to have really fierce horns. And they spiral, but sometimes they spiral so far that they spiral back into their head and eventually either kill them or disrupt their ability to be effective. Yeah, so I've heard of evolution described as a blind walk or a random walk through nearest neighbor possibility space. And yes, the good mutations end up becoming selective for over a long period of time. But it's not like they can make sudden huge shifts in body design or, throw out an old design and completely replace it with something brand new. It's always just an increment on an existing morphology.
Definitely. And I think to continue with that metaphor, like evolution being sort of this blind walk through a fitness landscape, because I think it's an interesting metaphor. Another point in time that was a real epiphany for me was actually when I was working at the FHI and I got to read Nick's draft of the vulnerable world hypothesis sort of early on. And he has this idea that, technologies that we invent, you can almost see every technology as like picking a ball, like we're from an urn, and you don't know which ball you're picking, and there are like black balls, which is essentially in extinction technologies, and they're white ones that might be like beneficial for all of mankind. But we're sort of picking all of those balls at random. And what occurred to me, because Bootstrap applies that to like technologies, like human-built technologies. But you can apply the same concept, I believe, to evolutionary technologies as well. So you can sort of see that, evolution is taking us through this random walk, but along the way, there are sort of these black balls. There are like adaptations that might seem beneficial at first, but might actually kill us in the long run. And you can sort of see it there if you Google something called like evolutionary suicide. It's sort of this emergent field, but we're seeing it more or less in more and more places where actually predators become too aggressive, so they kill all the prey and they kill themselves. There is also like slime mold that through various types of mutations make their own environment toxic. But there's also these mass extinctions in the past where bacteria or algae like multiplied so aggressively and rapidly that they changed the entire like chemistry of the atmosphere and killed a bunch of species along the way, or like killed a substantial fraction of all life on Earth. And all of these are sort of these evolutionary innovations, if you will. So that was also one point in time when I'm like, I got this aha moment, because I realized that what Bootstrap was describing might be applicable to evolution through natural selection more broadly as well.
Yes, the vulnerable world hypothesis, I read that too. And some of the sort of conclusions were quite scary about the sorts of things that might need to be done in order to achieve coordination. But let's not spoil all the beans quite yet. Yeah. We can bring up turnkey totalitarianism later.
Yeah.
It's been hypothesized that something like Spiegelman's monster that you bring up in the book could have actually wiped out our potential for multicellular life, or getting to a stage where there was a complex enough RNA molecule able to have enough nucleotides in it to scaffold the complexity for the type of life that we have and enjoy today.
I think that's just such a brilliant example for how natural selection is present not just in like sort of biological system, it's also like present in systems of chemistry. And I have this concept in the book called the Darwinian Demon, and I sort of describe and define a Darwinian demon as a selection pressure to behave in a way that is destructive for everyone else in the environment. And Spiegelman's monster is sort of one of these really early examples, probably, of a Darwinian demon in our evolutionary history. So there is this hypothesis called the RNA world, where essentially like the first replicators that later gave rise to sort of more complex life was RNA molecules that under certain conditions can sort of self-replicate, which is like huge. I mean, that is probably like one of the reasons why we have like sort of complex life. The thing is though that the only thing like evolution sort of cares about is the long-term like it's like the survival of whatever unit of selection you have. So it turns out like an RNA molecule it replicates a lot faster if it's a lot shorter. But you would want a long RNA molecule to like encode for genes and sort of the complexities of life. But it turns out that it's actually adaptive for RNA molecules if they're just sort of in this competitive world competing against each other. It's adaptive for them to be as short as possible. So like over time, and that has been observed in a lab setting, these replicators tend to become shorter and shorter because then they can replicate faster and faster and outcompete like the longer RNA molecules. So that in and of itself could have in some ways been the end of the journey of complexity of life. I mean, all we have is these like, you know, really short, aggressively multiplying replicators. So how did like evolution sort of solve for this? And that's where the other sort of concept enters into the picture from the book. I talk about the concept of Darwinian angels. So it's sort of a selection pressure for cooperation. And what happened probably is that, you know, these RNA molecules might have collaborated with some sort of lipid membrane. So essentially like a lipid membrane could sort of surround the RNA molecule and that way sort of, you know, defend it a little bit from these like Spiegelman's monster, like short RNA molecule defectors.
The Darwinian demon territory is a tragedy of the commons minefield. It's this sort of ever elusive, this Nash equilibrium that we're trying to achieve through cooperation. It doesn't seem as though it's really that easy to achieve. Well, some argue that Darwinian forces are so strong there's no real use struggling against them and no use really swimming against the currents. These, you know, I mean, and the only practical strategy is to go with the flow and like some say, well, AI is going to come about and there's nothing we can do about it. We might as well just pass on the torch or submit to the overwhelming force. So this AI or whatever you want to call it, a Leviathan, this Darwinian force, this strength of tide. So if some think that maybe if we are just kind to AI, or if we like effectively accelerate it, or you know, if we do everything we can to bring it about, then it might sort of smile at us and it might throw us a few crumbs once it takes over. Yeah, you mentioned in the book a variety of ways you can sort of perhaps set the dynamics to bring about a scenario where whether it be AI or the economy might behave a little bit better.
Yeah, so it's a couple of questions there. Like, I mean, what would it take to, or can you even sort of swim against the forces of evolution? Like, that's sort of the first question. And I think the second one, like for AI in particular, like how do evolutionary sort of dynamics form that And I think like on the first point, like, can you swim sort of against evolution and evolutionary selection pressures? I don't think you can, but I think you can sort of use evolutionary selection pressures for good. So I think, I mean, I've never done this sport myself, but I think like judo as a martial art, the whole sort of idea is to use the weight of your opponent sort of against them. And I think it's a similar thing you can do with these Darwinian demons, because we know from evolutionary history that like the fact that we exist is just like layer and layer and layer on cooperation. It's like cooperating molecules forming a metabolism, cooperating genes forming a genome, it's cooperating cells forming an organism, it's cooperating organisms like forming our society, right? So we know that it is possible to achieve like stable cooperation, and then once it exists and is stable, it will be adaptive and sort of, you know, stick around. I mean, that's how all of these like new units of selection have been formed throughout our evolutionary history. So I talk about this idea in my book about sort of a last transition, because we have had these major evolutionary transitions from single cell to multicellular organisms. But then we just move the competitiveness and Darwinian drives from one level to another. Instead of competition between cells, it becomes like competition against organisms. And then when organisms form societies, and those societies might have like rules and laws that sort of, you know, prevent us from acting in accordance to our like, you know, worse sort of demons, and it brings about our better angels, as I think Steven Pinker like brilliantly points out. But then you still have anarchy. Like even if you bring about the better angels through rules and laws within a nation state, like you still have anarchy between states. So you just like moved the arms race from one level to another, and that arms race today is like nuclear, and the arms race today is like, you know, probably Manhattan Project of AI happening soon. So when I talk about the last transition in the book, it's this idea of, can we achieve some sort of global governance where different nation states or entities are penalized for doing bad things and rewarded for doing good things? Because you have, if you sort of can tweak that reward function globally, it will actually be in everyone's interest to sort of behave in a pro-social way. And I believe that it is possible to achieve it. And if we do achieve it on a global level, like the reason why I call it the last transition is because there's almost no way where to go. Then we have like one governance system for all life on planet Earth, more or less, because we are the undisputed like champions of planet Earth. Like there is no other organism that can rival us. So if we manage to build a global system, it would essentially be capable of encompassing all life and sort of, you know, protect all life. So I think that answered the first part of the question. And then the second one was on AI arms races more specifically. But before we go there, I just want to pause a little bit and see if you want to go somewhere else or...
Yes. Okay. So you've spoken about the dynamics of cooperation and the way that organisms have sort of learnt to cooperate in evolution, but now I guess we're the dominant species, and we can use rationality, and we've also crafted techniques of cooperation through testing. We've been able to develop societies that have been able to cooperate on larger scales. We've developed laws and regulations so that it's very easy to predict behaviour, and it's much easier for people to cooperate on a wider scale. But I guess people might ask, well, isn't greed good? There was the mantra in the early 80s that greed is good. Can't, selfishness motivate people to innovate and drive to be able to produce products and services? There's people fighting each other over, dominance in a particular area where they can sell a product or provide a service. And so sometimes the quality of the services go up as a result. In fact, often they do. In some cases, when you get a monopoly, though, and people dominate the local ecosphere, the local niche, then there's the selective pressure doesn't work anymore. So I was just wondering about your thoughts about the balance between individual greed, individualism, and cooperation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that greed can indeed be very good. And I think it's all about what domains do you sort of apply it to. I think most societies, I don't know of any society that would sort of, allow any individual to produce any type of weapon that they would want to be sort of power hungry. So there are sort of certain domains. I mean, we might say, okay, within the domain of software, we think it's perfect if as many companies as possible sort of compete and build better and better services. But then we might realize that there are certain domains within software that, affect teenagers' health and increase suicide rates. So then we sort of regulate and set guardrails for that specific domain. So I think it's all domain specific because we want to avoid sort of the more catastrophic externalities where the greed is actually causing more harm than good, right? So I think in general, we're too black and white in our polarization. There's always sort of the left wing saying, oh, regulation is great. And then the right wing is like, oh, regulation is bad. It sucks. But it's all depends on where you apply it. And I think you can sort of do so, and you need to do so in a thoughtful way. What I can say, however, is I think if we only go by greed with no regulations whatsoever, it becomes the law of the jungle. By default, that's what happens. And I think Steven Pinker outlines that really well in The Better Angels of Our Nature. But I think you can only look at nature to sort of discover that. In nature, there are no government systems, there are no rules, there are no laws, and there are selection pressures to kill and eat others alive, parasites, eating animals alive from the inside. The amount of suffering, in nature, is beyond comprehension. I would not wish upon my worst enemies to be born into the body of a random species out in nature. That would be an absolutely horrible experience. And if we build our societies based on pure anarchy, I think that's where we will end up. And that's what we have seen historically with all weird types of capital punishment, where you're ripping people into pieces when they're alive, and all of these crazy things that existed just 100, 200 years ago, before the Enlightenment. So I'm very grateful for that laws exist, but the problem is that it doesn't exist on sort of the global arena. So it's still adaptive for countries to engage in these arms races. And I don't know if you have seen the movie Oppenheimer, but I think it's so telling when the scientists are like, we really don't want to build this bomb, but if we don't do it, the Nazis are going to do it, and it's going to be even worse. So they sort of have to do it, and there is a similar narrative now around artificial intelligence, because I think that's where you sort of started your question on AI specifically.
Yes.
We had this bipartisan congressional commission that recently had on the number one top priority for the US to stay competitive against China, to build a Manhattan Project for artificial intelligence. And we're doing that despite the most brilliant scientists within AI, like Geoffrey Hinton, like Nobel Prize laureate and Turing Award winner, and Joshua Bengio, and people like that saying like, hey, this is based on like bad science because we haven't solved the control problem. Like if we build this super intelligence, like we will not know how to control it.
Yeah, well, that's a difficult thing. I mean, but like in a similar way, we often think that maybe we can just convince the AI to do the right thing. Can't we just have faith in the good intentions of individuals to overcome the dark arts of defectors, whether they be other humans in control of large companies or just down the road, or artificial intelligence, right? Can't we just depend on the good nature of some people to sort of convince those on the precipice away from the brink there? Can't we just,
I wish we could.
Can't our goodness just shine?
I wish we could, but I think it's like norms will be broken over time, and good intention alone will never succeed. So take, for instance, gerrymandering. Like, okay, you redraw the political districts in order to sort of guarantee a successful outcome for your party in the next election. Like, when that happened the first time, it was sort of this taboo being broken, and everyone was so incredibly outraged that this gerrymandering thing was happening. And they draw like these political cartoons of the first person that did it, and like, this is horrible, like we should never do that again. The thing is that it worked. So you broke a taboo, and there was a sort of moral backlash, but over time, evolution through natural selection did its thing. Like, the politicians that actually engaged in the practice had higher chances of being elected. They had higher survival rates. So what evolved was essentially this like rhetoric of rationalization, that if we don't do it, someone else will do it, so we will have to do it. And now both parties are engaging in the practice and have engaged in the practice for a really long time. So this is sort of more to say and give a case study of, we might have the right moral compass and instinct, but that will be eroded over time by these Darwinian demon selection pressures. And to apply that for AI, I think there is a similar thing going on right now. Like, all of the founders of the big AI companies, they actually started their companies because they were concerned about AGI. Like, they have all read superintelligence. Like, they all sort of see that, okay, if I'm not creating this, then someone else will, and it better be me. And there is like these leaked emails between like Sam Altman and Elon Musk as they're establishing like OpenAI. And the reason why the emails are out there, because they're a part of this like legal process between Musk and OpenAI. And they're both saying that this is sort of inevitable, so we better build it first. But
Right.
what that has resulted in is now an arms race between like Anthropic, DeepMind, OpenAI, Meta, and others. And to just highlight how weird this is, like there was this statement a while back from some of my friends at the Future of Life Institute, saying like, pause the great AI experiment. Like, we need to pause for 6 months to just figure out how we can sort of control this. And that's a small ask. And none of the CEOs of any of the big AI labs signed this statement at all, with the only exception of Elon Musk, actually, who leads XAI. But at the same time, there was this other statement from the Center for AI Safety, and it was a very short statement. And it was actually signed by all of the leaders of the big AI labs, saying that artificial intelligence is an existential risk similar to nuclear weapons. So you sort of have these two statements where one statement is, okay, this is going to kill us. And the other statement is, we probably should stop. And they only signed the statement where this is going to kill us, and they did not sign the statement that we should stop. And the reason for that is, I mean, if they stop, someone else will win. So it's like the Manhattan Project and gerrymandering, like all over again. So I truly believe that the CEOs of these labs have good intentions, but they're sort of forced into this arms race.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as though if the one with the best intentions paused while everybody else just went straight ahead and didn't care, the ones who didn't care as much raced ahead, then we might be in a dynamic. I can see where they're coming from. They're worried that somebody with less scruples than they do will be the first to AI and will be the one that don't install the right safety mechanisms and cut corners, and will race each other to the bottom of all possible safety standards that could be implemented, and just try and get something out there as fast as possible for first mover advantage. I don't know how to work within this dynamic. I guess we can just hope we have enough time, and we hope that we can build in fault tolerance. So if constraint doesn't work, then motivation selection might work. There's all sorts of problems either way you go, whether it be through containment or by trying to motivate the AI to do the right thing by teaching it the right things, or putting it in an environment where the game theoretic dynamics select for good behavior. But we're short-sighted individuals, humans are. AI might not be as short-sighted. I don't know. But why did evolution program into us to be motivated by short-sighted goals?
Yeah, I think it goes back to... I think it actually goes back to evolution through natural selection itself. Because evolution through natural selection, you could sort of see it as this optimization algorithm. Like in computer science, that's actually like a common use case for evolution through natural selection. If you want to optimize for something, you can sort of, build a so-called evolutionary algorithm that sort of, optimizes for that thing. So I think so evolution through natural selection is an optimization algorithm, but unlike other types of algorithms, I mean, let's say you sort of use Bayesian inference, for instance, like you sort of look in to the future and you try to predict future outcomes. And that's not what evolution through natural selection is doing. I mean, it is working through trial and error. It is essentially saying that, this thing right here, this will be adaptive right now, but it might not be adaptive in the long run. And I can just sort of I've given other examples in the past. But another interesting example is like the Great Cod collapse. So it was this, the cod like almost sort of, went extinct outside of, Canada. The population collapsed entirely. And when you sort of looked more closely, it turns out that the cod was just sort of reacting to evolutionary selection pressures. And turns out that if you're a little bit smaller in size, then it's easier for you to escape from like fishing nets and escape like the biggest predator they have, namely humans. But if they become smaller as well, they also become less fertile. So so essentially what happened is like in the short run, evolving to become smaller and smaller, that those genes were selected for by evolution through natural selection, but it had the long-term consequence of the population collapsing because it also became infertile. I think the reason
that's just
why
within our lifetime, right? That's just within a very short period of time.
Yes,
imagine how many times that would have happened throughout natural evolution in the past. It could happen with us too.
No, I think it happens all the time, and I think that is a reason why species go extinct, because they traverse, to take your metaphor again with this random walk through the fitness landscape. You will bump into landmines. You will bump into these like black balls, to use Bostrom's metaphor, like along that random walk. And evolution through natural selection means that it's random. It's not like we do when we take a stroll. Us as humans, we might sort of think like a little bit like, okay, is there where do I want to go and how do I get there, etc., etc. And that's not how evolution works, essentially.
You bring up in the book the fragility of life hypothesis, which suggests that Darwinian demons could really obliterate life. Now they may have already taken down countless species already in the past. If they do take us down, then they're going to take us down and we're going to sort of get all desperate and probably do stuff with devastating weapons. We have nukes, we have AI, but we're getting more powerful AI soon, and perhaps soon we're going to be able to engineer very dangerous viruses. When we go down, a lot of other life will probably go down with us. And so how does this idea of the fragility of life hypothesis change our ethical responsibilities towards safeguarding biodiversity or preventing existential risks?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I feel like I want to deep dive a little bit to talk about like what is actually what is the fragility of life hypothesis exactly, because it's actually quite counterintuitive. And when I sort of realized that this might be the case, it was probably like the biggest epiphany in my life. So I think when we so first of all, the definition of the fragility of life hypothesis is that life might actually contain the seed to its own destruction, meaning that evolution through natural selection might actually sort of select for traits eventually that are so deadly that it kills all life on the planet. So that could be, for instance, okay, let's imagine a scenario where life only exists around like thermal vents on the ocean floor. It hasn't had the time to diversify yet. So we sort of go back in time like a few billion years ago. At that stage, maybe super virus or a super predator could have killed like all life, period. Or like, let's imagine like the transition from like single cell to multicellular organisms. Like, why did that take so incredibly long? And I think that's, again, because of Darwinian demons. If you have sort of this, I don't know, like small cluster of cells trying to collaborate and cooperate in some way, there will be incentives for defectors. And when a cell defects in our body, we call that cancer, right? And so cancer is not, generally a good thing. So we have sort of these examples, and you have this graph now from my book, like where I sort of go through previous mass extinctions. Like a lot of the mass extinctions we can see in the fossil record has actually not been caused by external things like, asteroids, but they have been caused by bacteria and algae, like spreading really, really rapidly, or like some sort of plants spreading that erode the soil, and so on. But then the ultimate question is, okay, if these landmines are everywhere as we sort of go the random walk of evolution in life, if these like landmines are everywhere, how come it seems like life is actually optimizing for collaboration and good things? I mean, we have sort of seen this march towards like more and more complex life. And as I said earlier, like it's so amazing when you think about it, like me, like I'm not like just a human. I'm a colony of cells and bacteria, giving rise to me as sort of, an entity, which is just like insane to think about. So how does those two things square? Like it seems like these landmines are everywhere, and evolution might kill us at any point. But yet, if we look throughout our evolutionary history, like complexity and beauty has evolved over time. So do we really, really need to be worried? And here is the epiphany that I got. And this was again inspired by Nick Bostrom and sort of the idea of anthropic reasoning, yes, or like selection bias, observational selection effects. Yeah. So the thing is that when we look at our evolutionary history, that's just one single data point. That's just a single data point. And by definition, we will always find ourselves in a universe that like allows our own existence. I mean, we can't by definition find ourselves at a data point where we are dead. Like by definition, that can't happen. So the thing is that we don't know. Like if we look out throughout the universe, it might very well be the case that life has originated in lots and lots of places, but they have never evolved to be complex enough because of these Darwinian demons. Like maybe they never evolved to become multicellular because the selection pressure to defect through cancer was just like too big. So more complex organisms never formed. Or even, there could be the case that for most of these like random walks in general on other planets, you will hit a landmine and you will die as a result. And maybe that landmine is some sort of super virus or something else. So the point that I'm making with the fragility of life hypothesis, and it is only a hypothesis, I don't know if it's true, sure. But the statement is essentially like, we can't know by just looking at our evolutionary history if life is sort of this stable process that reaches equilibrium and optimize for more and more beautiful things. Like we can't draw that conclusion because we're just looking at a single data point. And I know that I went on a little bit of a tangent there.
But
I think
it's important.
The original question was around like, okay, more what do we do based on this?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, but it is fascinating, and I'm intrigued at all the explanations for the Fermi paradox that there are out there, and there's probably a variety of them, and great filters. I've interviewed Robin Hanson on the very subject of the great filter quite some time ago. But yes, the idea that if we do survive, we might be able to find an answer to this, and I really would like to know. If we do go to other planets, we see short-chain RNA molecules or whatever the equivalent is on some phylogenetic tree somewhere else, then maybe that'll help inform what's the reason for the silence in the cosmos. Yeah.
And I honestly wouldn't be surprised. It doesn't seem like biogenesis is the great filter. It seems like biogenesis is not that hard. I mean, it is like, I think it's like, so more or less chemical determinism. If you just have the right ingredients, and the right ingredients seem to be quite abundant throughout the universe, like, then you will have organic chemistry, and then you will get, sort of RNA replicators, or like something like catalytic sets, if you're sort of more of a fan of a metabolism first hypothesis rather than an RNA world hypothesis. So I actually think, like, if we go to Europa and some of these other places, I would not be surprised if we actually find like sort of organic chemistry and life. And I wouldn't even be surprised if we find like sort of dead life, that life sort of occurred, but then it died, but then maybe it rebooted again and died, and rebooted again and died, because of these like Darwinian demons, because of predators, or because of viruses, or because of other like really sort of destructive like landmine strategies, more or less.
So it seems very important that the dynamics that evolution converges on, that we find something a whole lot more safe. Evolution has stumbled upon cooperation as well, but as you mentioned, that might not be all that common.
Yeah, I mean, we're in this incredibly biased like vantage point. I mean, first of all, we're born on Earth, which is like completely unique. I mean, there might not be like a single planet like ours that has life and is teeming with life in all of our Milky Way galaxy, probably. But even within planet Earth, like, we're sort of in this biased, privileged position where we think that, life is great, and we're most of us at least are living fairly good lives as humans. But if you would be any other species, you would sort of realize that the law of the jungle is a horrible, horrible thing. And there is like such immense suffering that we're like completely shielded from. So we're in this like privileged position within an extremely privileged position.
Yeah. Look, Charles Darwin did write about universal Darwinism. There's replication, there's repair, there's intelligence as well. These are and specific social structures that are, and technologies that seem somewhat aligned with the better angels, the better Darwinian angels, so to speak. Do you see examples in nature or that have emerged in culture? Do you see them as aligning with the holy grail of, cooperative alignment?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to look at like multicellular organisms, especially because the cooperation is sort of stable enough for a new unit of selection to emerge. I mean, my cells are cooperating so stably that instead of calling me like a colony, even though I am a colony, like I see myself as like an individual, because this cooperation is so incredibly strong. But that's not for granted. I mean, for billions of years, like multicellular life like didn't exist properly, and then we had sort of the Cambrian explosion, and then all sorts of multicellular life and multiple variants of it sort of all of a sudden came into existence. Like I think that level of collaboration is incredibly hard to achieve, but once it is achieved, it just opens up for so many possibilities. And life had to invent like a couple of things. I mean, we first of all had to invent like various mechanisms to police cancer. So if a cell in the colony is sort of defecting and saying, oh, I'm not going to care about your programming and your rules, like it is beneficial for me and to just replicate as quickly as possible and then take over the like whole colony. I mean, that was what cancer is. So we had to like develop like this policing of cancer. We had to develop like mechanisms to prevent like sort of rapid replication. I mean, some might argue that that's what the sort of telomeres are doing, and why we have sort of this programmed cell death, and that is behind aging. It actually helped us to against cancer. And so there is prevention of like aggressive replication, like policing, then also more sort of like division of labor, where different sort of cells in your body have specific tasks. There is blood cells and bone, and there's neurons, etc., etc. So I think there is certainly sort of things to learn from that. And I mean, the most successful societies have the same sort of mechanism. I mean, we have policing against defectors, like we have rule of law, we have we have like division of labor through like universities and the whole like educational system, and so on.
We have the cooperation involved in the scientific enterprises as well.
Yes.
But that's even been infected by Darwinian demons as well, as you bring up in your book, like, hacking.
Yeah, p-value hacking and the replication crisis and all of that, right?
Yes. And people sort of not publishing results that don't, favour the sponsor's goals, for instance.
Yeah, sure. Like I think it's the same thing, like, again, right? I mean, in order to survive as a scientist, like doing science, you need to get that grant money. So that's like a selection pressure to get access to grants. And then to sort of win doing that, like, you need to get a bunch of citations, and there are sort of evolved these indices, like supposedly measuring like how successful you are as an academic, like the age index, for instance. You're more likely to get grants if you have a really good age index. But the way you can sort of hack that is in like multiple ways. You can first of all like produce a bunch of like new studies instead of producing replication studies. Like a lot of replication studies are a lot harder to sort of produce, and you're not creating something new, sexy and exciting, even though replication studies are like 100% needed, in order for science to work. Another way you can do things is through p-value hacking. Essentially, you can just sort of tweak the parameters in your model. You can remove like specific data points, and you can just like do a little bit of that where it's like barely noticeable. That data point seems a little bit off. So, of course it must be a outlier. It's fine for me to sort of delete it. And then you do a little bit of tinkering until you get like a so-called statistically significant result. And if you have that, you're more likely to be published in Nature and cited by others and get like a higher age index. Then there's the methods which is outright fraudulent. And we have seen a lot of that lately. Especially because a lot of these especially because of AI, actually. So some researchers have applied AI to detect like fraud in medical journals. So that's essentially like if images have been manipulated. So there can be like microscope images of like neurons or whatever else, where, you know, the researchers have actually gone in with Photoshop to show something that that doesn't exist. So there has been a lot of these things lately, or like outright like making data up. And the thing is, like, just like I said with gerrymandering, like we know it to be true that we shouldn't do those things. Like, you know, we sort of have the moral gut reaction that, you know, we should probably not engage in any of those things. But then we discover over time, like, in order to be a successful academic, you need to play these games like at least a little bit. Like, maybe not go to like outright fraud, but, you know, like just like removing one data point, or like maybe focusing more at a particular sort of sexy field of research where you're more likely to get a lot of citations, rather than something that is like not particularly sexy. So yeah, that's how some of these Darwinian demons actually have affected, and I think is infecting the whole scientific enterprise. But I do want to say, like, as well, that, I mean, the scientific method and scientific institutions and scientific peer review is still by far the best methods we have to converge on something truthful. So this is, I don't want to say that, you know, science is shit and not working, because it actually is working. Like, we're detecting a lot of these fraudulent things, but Darwinian demons has made science worse. I think there's no denying that.
Yeah, well, in Melbourne, there's a bunch of people working on meta-science and how to detect fraud in science, and I believe AI can help, and also detecting misinformation in general. But in meta-science, you know, hacking, hypothesizing before the results are known, and p-hacking and all those sorts of stuff seems reasonably endemic. Maybe it's not as common anymore now that we have more mature meta-science and more of a general understanding that there's flaws with the way that humans do science. Doesn't mean that the actual scientific enterprise is faulty. It just means that there's people involved, and there's ways that we can sort of regulate and shift the dynamics of the incentive landscape to incentivize better behavior. And maybe there's something that people can draw from your book in meta-science to help incent good behavior, maybe some sort of reputation market within the scientific community. That could be kind of cool.
Yeah, so in the last part 3 of my book, I talk about, like, okay, how can we actually, like, solve some of these problems? Because there is a lot of doom and gloom and fragility of life. We're all gonna die. Like, there's an AI arms race and power arms race, and like, we're in the middle of this huge species extinction where like half of all species will go extinct within our lifetime because of environmental destruction. So it all seems like pretty bad, but then the question is, like, what can we actually do about it? And there is sort of 2 things that I talk about. Like, the first thing is that what gives me hope is that the entire world economy and all humans are so incredibly interconnected. So every single small thing that we buy, like, day to day, like just a simple thing like a chicken sandwich, for instance, like it's a marvel, like, how we can buy a chicken sandwich for, like, you know, a couple of dollars in the supermarket. And there was actually this guy on the internet that tried to make a chicken sandwich truly from scratch. Truly from scratch doesn't mean just bringing out some chicken from the fridge and put some, spread on it or whatever. Truly from scratch meant feeding the chicken, growing the grain, milling the grain into flour and baking it, etc., etc. And it took him 6 months and $1,500 to produce a chicken sandwich from scratch. So what I want to tell with that story is a story of how incredibly interconnected everyone is. The reason why we can buy a chicken sandwich for only a couple of dollars is because we have all of these hyper specialized and efficient production processes in interlinked global value chains. So why am I telling you that? Well, when it comes to all of these risks, like risk of nuclear war, risk of artificial intelligence, risk of engineered pandemics, they're all technology enabled. And each and every one of those technologies have incredibly complex and specialized value chains. And in those value chains, there's always bottlenecks. So if that particular bottleneck in the value chain says, okay, we're not going to do this particular process unless you guys downstream mitigate the risk. So take AI, for instance, you might have an AI lab producing a dangerous AI model. But the reason they can't produce that is because they're buying all of these H100 GPUs from NVIDIA. And NVIDIA can design their chips because they're all manufactured in the same factory in Taiwan by TSMC. And they can manufacture all of these silicon wafers because of lithography machines from the Netherlands. And each of these nodes in the overall network of the technology, if one of those nodes stop providing whatever service that they are providing downstreams in the value chain, the entire thing collapses. So you wouldn't be able to produce a dangerous AI model if the other guys in the value chain sanction you and say, we're not going to be a part of your particular value chain anymore. Thank you and goodbye. So I call these nodes critical governance nodes. So it's sort of interesting because you can transform what seems to be an intractable problem of governing AI into the governance of computer chips. Or you could turn it into the governance of critical raw materials that are needed for the semiconductor industry. And similarly, if you want to govern the risk of engineered pandemics, you can govern critical lab equipment and making sure that is properly governed, or even the suppliers of the critical lab equipment manufacturers. So I think there is the fact that we're all so incredibly interconnected means that there are these leverage points. And I wish that people in the sort of effective altruism or existential risk sort of reduction community looked into this a little bit more. I would love for us to map these value chains to a larger extent, so we actually know where we can put on leverage in order to prevent really dangerous things from being developed. But that brings us to the point of reputational markets.
Yes.
So the question is okay, that sounds good in theory, but how do we know if a particular actor is developing something that is dangerous? So the idea of a reputational market is to essentially outsource that judgment. So instead of having like a central government entity saying, oh, you're bad, you're good, etc., etc., you would essentially outsource it to prediction markets. So you could essentially, anyone could create a bet on, okay, I believe that, OpenAI might enable a major bioterrorism attack before 2027. So that might, for instance, be a prediction on a reputational market. And the beautiful property about reputational markets and prediction markets more generally is that participants are incentivized to reach like truth convergent outcomes. Like if you actually are better at predicting if OpenAI will enable like a terrorism attack, you actually get rewarded, like you get monetary rewards, like similar to if you're playing on sport betting and betting on the right team. So it works in quite similar ways. So the idea is that, okay, what if you can sort of decentralize that whole process of figuring out like who are developing technologies that could have huge externalities on the rest of society, and then you could essentially enable these like critical governance nodes to have a little bit more transparency of like, oh, like this prediction market, reputational market, think that this AI company is going to do some really bad things. We might not want to be a part of that. And again, you can't just trust like people's like goodwill and love and ethical norms, etc., etc. So a way you could incentivize like these critical governance nodes to actually sanction a dangerous technology provider would be to say, okay, if you actually don't sanction that provider, you will get like a bad reputational rating yourself, and then you might in turn get sanctioned. And it's interesting if you simulate that whole system of, okay, if you don't sanction, you might get sanctioned yourself. There are actually interesting equilibrias where it becomes an entirely new norm of saying, okay, if I'm worried about someone creating existential harm, I'm going to sanction them, because otherwise I know that I'm going to be sanctioned myself. So that's sort of the general idea of reputational markets. And I think the beautiful thing about them is that they're truth convergent, they are decentralized, and we're not like giving moral authority to any particular centralized party. And they can adapt to new information quite quickly. Like, okay, a bunch of safety people are leaving this lab, so that should probably influence this prediction on like a major terrorism attack happening, for instance. So they can adapt to like changes more or less real time as well, which is why I think they're quite exciting as a way to achieve like more collaboration and leveraging the fact that we're all so incredibly interconnected in the world economy.
There's the concept of the Great Bootstrap in the book, which is a rewiring of the global fitness landscape. Does reputation markets exist as the main cause of this Great Bootstrap, or does it fit in with a constellation of strategies to incent good behavior?
Yeah, I think we need a bunch of different strategies. I would be surprised if reputational markets alone can sort of sufficiently rewire the fitness landscape to be more angelic rather than demonic in nature. So I think we need like a bunch of different strategies, everything from like, taking global governance more seriously, or reform the European Union, sorry, I meant to say the United Nations actually, but I think the EU
Sure.
could need some much needed reform as well. So I think we need to have like a multiple strategies and pursuing multiple strategies at once. But I do think reputational markets are particularly exciting. But I'm also a little bit biased.
Well, one of the concerns that have come up, I've asked some other people about this. I posted about this up-and-coming interview on the Hedonistic Imperative forum, and some people are concerned about gaming reputational markets. Now, in what ways do you think reputational markets could be gamed, and how would you consider making it more fault tolerance against gaming?
Yeah, so I think having multiple sort of success metrics for any particular, like, I guess, prediction for any given prediction on the reputational market. So essentially saying that we're not just gonna rely on one piece of data, we're gonna have several pieces of data. So let's say, for instance, you want to evaluate like health outcomes. It might not be enough to just ask people, are you healthy? You might want to test it in other ways. And the more sort of metrics and measurements that we sort of add, the harder the system becomes to game. And I think it's important as well to be a bit, rigorous and specific. What are sort of the resolution criteria of a particular bet on the market? If there exists sort of ambiguity, it's also easier to sort of game the system. But sort of, in an ideal world, any type of bet or question on a reputational market should be verifiable, like by any third party, more or less, like sort of similar to how anyone can actually measure the circumference of the earth, like independently, and you sort of achieve independent results, or anyone can sort of measure the height of the Eiffel Tower. We don't need to trust a particular sort of centralized authority to tell us how tall the Eiffel Tower is. I mean, I tend to trust like Wikipedia when I read how tall the Eiffel Tower is, but if I go to Paris, I can actually find it out myself. So I don't need to trust on anyone. So I think if we design the reputational market with sort of that, never trust, always verify philosophy in mind, with multiple different sort of metrics for anything that we might want to measure, I think we can make it a lot more robust. But knowing how people will game the system, it is hard before you deploy it. So I actually think like the only way of really finding out how people can deploy it in clever ways or exploit it in clever ways is to deploy the market and experiment a little bit.
Yeah, you bring up in your book that often when optimizing for a narrow range of goals, or selfish goals, for instance, often that comes at the expense of some other utility somewhere else. So negative externalities, for instance, aren't really the concern of the companies that create the externalities. They're the concern of the commons, unfortunately. But about the reputation markets, like most systems, reputation-based systems can fail when there's a mismatch between getting the good reputation and creating the good outcome.
Yeah.
So Goodhart's law, which you mention a lot in the book, suggests that if the metric becomes the objective, then it's no longer a good measure. how to stop reputation hacking in this way, where people are just getting reputation for reputation's sake for some way, where it doesn't really improve some social welfare function.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a reason why Goodhart's law exists, and it's like similar to the problem of like, you know, misspecification in artificial intelligence and like the AI alignment problem. It's, you know, whenever like a very narrowly defined and inflexible metric becomes like the sort of more or less definition of good, then it's easy to hack. Like, so take for instance my previous field of carbon accounting. So I started like a carbon emissions accounting startup called Normative. And
yes, great name by the way.
Something that we have observed a lot within this industry is that it's actually possible for companies to sort of, you know, hack the metrics a little bit by, you know, using specific so-called emission factors, and through like some ambiguities in the accounting principles, they can hack the metric. And I mean, sort of imagine a world where carbon becomes like the only outcome we care about. Like, I would not want to live in that world, because, you know, the best way of like reducing emissions might be to kill all humans. So like if we invent super intelligence, even though I would love to reduce emissions, I'm definitely not gonna give the terminal goal to the super intelligence to reduce carbon emissions. Then it will probably figure out that, you know, killing us is the easiest way of you know, achieving that task. So how are reputational markets different? I think they're way more flexible. So instead of just having one centralized authority, like, you know, an employer or like the government or someone who is sort of deploying this incentive, saying, oh, this is how we're gonna do it. Like, this is what good looks like. You actually outsource it in a way more dynamic way that is sort of actually truth convergent. So like you might have one bet on the reputational market about one thing, and then another bet about another thing, and you have like all of these new bets and questions propping up that relates to what we believe, how well we believe a sort of specific entity is serving the public good. But if it turns out that was wrong, or like that they're sort of hacking or gaming the system, it's sort of there are incentives to sort of, you know, find that out. Like, if they seem to be performing a lot better than they're actually performing, if they're releasing like, you know, bullshit carbon reports, then you have all of the incentives in the world as sort of a trader on the reputational market to expose that, because you will make a ton of money. And there is actually these like short selling firms like Hindenburg Research, for instance. I love what they're doing. They have like exposed a lot of corporate fraud, and they've made a lot of money in the process, because they're doing all of these like investigations and into different businesses, and then they're short selling the stock, and when they sort of release the reports, the stock will tank, and they will make a lot of money. So that's sort of just an example of at least how I imagine that these reputational markets might be different, that you create sort of more of an incentive landscape that is truth convergent. And if you are trying to like fudge the numbers as an enterprise, there are like sort of clear incentives for others to find out about it. Similar to how there's like incentives for like our financial markets to correct And they tend, I mean, sometimes financial markets are wrong for a really, really long time, but they tend to sort of converge, I think, towards the true value of a business better than anything else, because of the fact that you're incentivized to seek the truth if you're gambling on the stock market.
Interesting. Yeah. So just on a topic of the constellation of ways to improve the dynamic, David Pierce has asked a question. The nature of selection pressure changes when prospective parents pre-select and design the genetic makeup of their children in anticipation of the likely behavioural and psychological effects of their choices. So, do you favour genome reform, or what critics call eugenics?
Oh yeah, that's a very difficult question.
It is.
And I think there's
Yeah.
various like variants of that, right? So I mean, clearly we are hardwired in a way that makes us sort of quite aggressive and expansionist in nature, and that is like that psychological sort of property is what's behind a lot of the problems. So I mean, we have people sort of in favor of like gene editing. There's other like proponents of like sort of a more almost psychedelics based approach. Like imagine that you could invent something like, you know, 10 times more powerful than ayahuasca. And ayahuasca sort of has this property, like people that have taken it, they sort of describe that they just feel this incredible alignment with all other like life on the planet. It's sort of almost like taking a shortcut in Buddhism. Like you don't have to like go through all of the meditation to reach enlightenment, but still like, you know, you still sort of go back to your old ways if you don't have like the right practice combined with an experience like that. So maybe if we could invent something that is like 10 times more powerful. And I think like generally, like I'm in favor. Like I don't see why like our particular like sort of genetic makeup should be like the pinnacle of existence. Like, I mean, we have this huge evolutionary mismatch where we feel like anxiety for the most silly things. Like we have a fight and flight system that sort of saved our lives back in the days. But now we have the same fight or flight system when someone is saying, oh, I actually don't like the color of your shirt, or like you have something stuck in between your teeth, or like silly things when people are sort of, you know, maybe even trying to help us. It triggers like a fight and flight response that creates a lot of unnecessary suffering and conflict and so on. So I would be in favor of getting rid of those things. But I would tread like immensely carefully, because especially when it comes to like, you know, gene editing and those sorts of interventions, you might have like these almost Darwinian selection pressures playing a role again. Like, you know, okay, what if we edit the gene instead in a way that desensitize make people desensitized to war, or what if we develop like pharmaceutical like medicines where you can become sort of the perfect like warrior, or the perfect aggressive like hedge fund manager, or the perfect like profit maximizing CEO, or whatever. So like I'm in favor of these interventions, but we just need to be incredibly careful when we deploy them, so we don't like give even more like ammunition to like the Darwinian demons and Darwinian brides.
Yeah, that's right. You used to work just around the corner from Julian Savulescu at Future of Humanity Institute. Another fellow Australian, by the way.
Yeah.
So there seems to be an over prevalence of Swedes and Australians in that corner of the world too. So, yeah, Julian Savulescu has brought up the idea of moral enhancements. And so I guess this is similar to David's sort of strategy in that
Yep.
you're trying to influence the dynamics of how people work together by improving people. But I wonder if there's strategies within moral enhancement to do it at a population level rather than just individual, reforming genomes or giving people a moral enhancement pill. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about.
I mean, there probably are, right? Like, I mean, if you look at the drinking water, or like micronutrient fortification, well, like we put like iodine in like a lot of products that we buy in the supermarket because it like enhances our health. And it's done in an incredibly scalable way where we don't even think about it. We don't know that the food that we're buying through regulation is actually enhanced to make us more healthy with like something like iodine to avoid like iodine deficiency. So there could be something sort of similarly scalable. But I think you could sort of, I don't know, like, you would have to think about that type of stuff like incredibly carefully because there is also like a very dystopian flip side of that, right? Like, okay, they put funny things in our drinks and in our food in order to make us more complacent as like citizens or something like that. So there are like, certain, I guess certain Pandora's boxes almost that we want to open like really carefully here. But I'm not disagreeing with David. I'm not disagreeing with Julian either. Like I think we probably need some sort of moral enhancement. And I'm definitely don't think that we are the pinnacle of evolution. Like I wish like my whole fight or flight system was more well adapted to like the lives we live now. Like, we're seeing so much anxiety and bullshit, like, and needless fights between like in relationships and so on, where it's like so easy to solve. Like if we would just be better at like empathy and seeing other people's perspectives instead of getting this like fight or flight response where, oh, now I need to like debate and I need to beat you and I want to see you suffer and those like types of instincts. Like, I honestly think we would live much better lives and we would just be like happier as well. So I think it's sort of not just like sort of this dystopian thing where okay, it's used to control us to become more like, fit into a certain, a certain template. But I think it's actually something that could make us live happier and more fulfilling lives as well. So from pure sort of selfish reasons, I would want us to like be enhanced in some ways, but we need to be careful.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're playing with powerful tools today.
Yeah.
We're playing with AI. We may be able to help modulate mood and reduce people's fight or flight responses, but on the other hand, it could be the same technology could be used to sort of increase them. I mean, social media sort of nudges people psychologically in ways that affect voting behaviours and buying patterns, and advertisements been around for some time now, but it just seems to be getting a lot more fine-tuned. So the social experiment that that social media was has sort of played out in ways that maybe some people expected, but maybe a lot of people didn't. I don't think we were very prepared.
No, for sure.
For the
and
fallout.
I think like for social media, I think it's such a good example of how a technology can be used for both good and for bad, but whether it is used for good or for bad depends on the incentive landscape in which it's deployed. So I think like when social media became big, like in the like end of the 2000s, it was sort of this narrative that social media will lead to global democracy. Because everyone will be connected and there will be nowhere for totalitarian states to hide. And it will build the global democracy. And like the Arab Spring happened as well, like fueled by social media. And everyone was just incredibly excited about that. But turns out that actually now a lot of dictators are using social media to actually enhance their control. Like social media is being used by like a dictatorial regime in Myanmar to commit genocide against Rohingya Muslims, to just like name an example. So I think very few people now would say like, okay, social media like led to global democracy, because it clearly didn't. So the narrative has shifted. So the question is like, what went wrong? And I think social media had the potential of leading to global democracy, but it all depends on the incentive structures for which the technology is deployed. And in this case, the incentive structures was a pay-per-click model in a feed, where essentially to survive as a social media company, you had to sort of create this feed and you had to mix advertisement into this feed and you had to mix advertisement into people's content. And it sort of became this thing where like the more sort of clickbaity a headline becomes, the more clickbaity the thumbnails on videos become, and the more outraged you become, the more likely you are to click on the content, and then the social media companies makes more money. So if we would have sort of thought about that when we deployed like the technology of social media, I think we could have predicted the outcome a lot better. And I think there's a huge problem within Silicon Valley where people don't think about the incentive structures in which the technology is deployed. You only think about like all of the positive aspects. And I think we're seeing that with AI now as well. Like, you know, okay, AI could reform education, it could cure cancer, it could give us like energy, it could solve climate change. Yes, of course it can do all of those things. But what does the incentive structure look like where we deploy artificial intelligence? Well, it's a power maximizing and profit maximizing incentive structure. So if you deploy it in a corporate setting, like, do you want it to maximize like human well-being, or do you want it to maximize profit? If you deploy AI in a military setting, like let's say you're, you know, Israel or Ukraine or Russia, and you deploy AI, do you want it to maximize the chances of you winning the war, or do you want it to maximize like human rights? So there is clearly a selection pressure for the AI to behave in a particular way. And I think if we're blind to those selection pressures, the deployment of AI can go horribly, horribly wrong. And it doesn't even need to be super intelligence for it to go horribly, horribly wrong. Similar to the deployment of social media with pay-per-click models went horribly, horribly wrong.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, it's been wonderful having you on the show, Kristian. It's been a really good read. I thought I'd enjoy it, but as I read it, I realized that it's really worth reading, and it's got a lot of insight. I can tell you've done a lot of research, and I can tell that there's been a whole heap of energy that you've put into this book. And I guess that's come from your experience helping Nick Bostrom sort of do some research for his book, Superintelligence. So yeah, it's amazing book, and I recommend everybody buy a copy and read it as quickly as possible, because these sorts of discussions, these sorts of things, I think can really have an outsized impact in contributing to a better future for sure.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you for such a great conversation. This was a real treat.